My name is Sarila Makli. I am the director of Conflict Research Network West Africa. Conflict Research Network West Africa is a network of researchers based in Africa, in West Africa, working on issues of peace and security, fragility, resilience, violent extremism, and other issues that are relevant to the stability, peace, and prosperity of the people of West Africa. We are mainly emerging and established researchers, young researchers also. So membership base cuts across all levels of our career trajectories in the region. We also are based in universities and institutions in the region, but are also made up of independent researchers and scholars. We organize workshops, conferences, events, but also conduct research for our members. For colleagues, for partners, and encourage our members to conduct research that's relevant for their career progress. Today, we have with us Professor Freedom Onouha, who will be discussing issues of how the military coups in West Africa have been shaping or affecting the trajectories of violent extremism in the region. You're welcome, Professor Onouha.
Thank you so very much, Terila. Nice to see you again.
Indeed. Professor Onouha is a professor at the Professor of Political Science at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. He has worked extensively on the issues of violent extremism. He has also worked extensively on issues of climate change, issues of insecurity, issues of militancy. He is one of the leading scholars and researchers on conflicts, peace and security in Nigeria. Today, he will be sharing with us his research, but also reflecting on the critical question of what military coup means for the fight against violent extremism in West Africa. As you all know, we have seen a rise in military coups in the region, especially in countries in the Sahel where violent extremist groups have taken root. And we have also seen a movement of these violent extremist groups towards coastal West Africa. Today, we'll be discussing some of these issues based on his research and his work. In fact, today, I think he's also in one of these countries and not even in the region. So he has deep insight. And so, Professor Onouha, let's start first of all by reflecting on military coups. What explains, from your own view and from your research, what explains the rise or the emergence of military coups in the region again, after so many years of attempts to democratize the region?
Well, thank you again, Terila, for trying to put together a very interesting topic for us. And like you said, I am not within my own country right now. I am actually speaking to you very close to the headquarters of the Multinational Joint Task Force in N'Djamena, Chad. And so I breezed in to use my hotel room. Please, in case anytime my network is not too good, just start me up, just call my WhatsApp, and then I can switch network, because I've noticed the network is not too good here. So I can always switch networks. So thank you once again for having me. And to your question, I think, again, we need to put a bit of a context to why we have seen a sudden surge, not just resurgent. I think we're now seeing a surge in the incident of coup d'etat in Africa in general, but in West Africa in particular. I think in the sense of the historical context, studies have shown that of the 442 coup d'etat that was recorded from 1960 up to 2012, Africa accounted for 229 of that incident. And much of that incident also took place in West Africa, particularly you see countries that are known to have experienced coup like Niger, Nigeria, a bit of that, more of Mali, and then to some extent, countries like Guinea. Well, people have begun to ask a lot of questions. Why are we now seeing something that we felt to have put off the light, shut the door, and said goodbye? I think a lot of convergence of factors play a key part in this regard. First, we must need to begin to understand that there appears to be growing discontent within the larger African population of the failure of the democracy to deliver or to live up to expectation in terms of what people have invested their hope on. And of course, you look at the hierarchy of need, Maslow's hierarchy of need. The issue of security is actually fundamental to every human being, every organization, and every state. In fact, I think the capacity of a state to provide security is the cardinal measure of its legitimacy as well as its capacity. And so where states have been unable, unwilling, or incapable to deliver on security, then there's always a tendency for you to see non-state actors to challenge that state, but more importantly, even for state actors in the form of the military to begin to intervene in politics. In the context of Africa, I think a lot of factors would explain that, and I'll look at it from the point of view of geopolitical factors, I'll look at it from the point of view of governance factors, and then I'll zero in on the point of view of security factors, which is very, very critical. From a geopolitical point of view, I think we have seen the manifestations of the coup we have seen, if you watch very carefully, has been predominantly Francophone countries. And that gives you a sense of the historical roots, which boils down to the whole question I told you about growing discontent on the way and manner in which colonial vestiges are believed to, whether genuinely or otherwise, but colonial vestiges are believed to be holding down some of these African countries from realizing their full potentials, from having the kind of economic freedom that is necessary for government to deliver on some of the democratic dividends. So to a very large extent, it's not a mistaken fact that these coups are taking place in France. And I think it's because of the kind of legacy that France have had, including maintaining its finance policies that makes these countries to keep a lot of their earnings in France and then only go back to France to withdraw them. So the growing discontent around the French vestiges is a factor, which I think another geopolitical connection is the fact that Russia is also trying to to exploit that growing discontent in Francophone countries, to be able to get a foothold in Africa. So a bit of discontent with French colonial vestiges, but more importantly, from a geopolitical factor, the growing influence of Russia in current interest and favor and partnership with some of these African countries, perhaps could explain some of the geopolitical factors that account for the resurgence of Q. From a governance perspective, I think we need to look at it from two levels. First is the level of the capacity of democratically elected governments to be able to deliver on some of those expectations, some basic expectations like provision of education, provision of pipe-borne water, provision of basic amenities that people require in Africa to survive. Some of these democratic governments, as we call it, have not been able to live up to those expectations, particularly for the generations that we consider to be youth. And so people are already growing discontent with this governance democratic system that has not been able to live up to expectation. But again, it's important to then ask one important question that I think reflects on the resurgence of coup, which is to what extent are democratic governments complicit in the resurgence of coup? We have also seen cases where, governments that supposedly came to power through elections have become a major impediment to the democratic processes and credentials of that country. We can easily mention the case of Guinea-Conakry, the long process of how Alpha Conde struggled with the regime until he then became elected. Then again, when he got to that position, he decided to begin to play the politics of tenure elongation. So part of it is that democracy has been failing people in terms of expectations, but more importantly also is the fact that democratic governments have themselves turned to be actually the nemesis of democracy, because those who have benefited from this electoral process have tended to manipulate the electoral process. And I said Guinea-Conakry is a typical example of this incident. That in itself had played a role in the resurgence of coup. The third layer of factor, I think, again, is what connects to the topic of today, which is the role of the upsurge or the fundamental deterioration of security as a result of the proliferation of violent extremist groups, particularly in two critical regions of West Africa. I'm talking about the Liptako-Guma region, which is a tribal region bordering Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and the Lake Chad region, again, which is a water body region that connects or straddles four countries, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, that shares the Lake Chad. These two critical regions in West Africa, the Liptako-Guma region as well as the Lake Chad region, I think has become the major hotbeds of the rise and reign of violent extremist organizations. And so where states have been unable or incapable of providing for the security needs of its population, I think again that disenchanted officers have then taken to coup. And the point is simple. When they don't take to this coup in order to dethrone the democratic elected government, they always justify their motivations for interventions on the ground that the democratic governments have not been able to rein in these violent extremist organizations. But I think it's going to be another question we can discuss in future, which is the fact that the fundamental justification for which they've overthrown the democratic elected government, have they been able to do better? I think that is more or less, like I said, the convergence of these geopolitical governance and security factors could account for why we are now seeing the problem we are seeing in terms of the resurgence of coup d'etat in West Africa.
Thank you very much, Freedom. I actually like how you demonstrate that there is no single variable that can be used to explain the resurgence of coup in Africa, or as you say, the surge of coups in West Africa, but rather that we have, this is a multivariable shaped process, and that we have governance, security, economic issues, and all things combined. And also, I would have loved to, as a political scientist, dig into issues of governance, but today we are talking about security. So let me take you on the issues of security and how security, in your view, I would like you, from your research and from your work, how do you think that these spaces of insecurity emerge, especially in these countries where we have seen coups? How do you think what explains the process leading to the proliferation of jihadist groups in these countries that threaten the security and leads to discontent, fueling coups?
Well, again, there's no singular factor that explains the descent of deterioration of insecurity in these states. I think to a very large extent that some of the factors are context specific, but I think we need to look at it from the point of view of convergence of internal and external factors. I think as a student of violent extremism, I think we really need to appreciate the whole role of external jihadi movements, a jihadi ideology in terms of spurring or in terms of reinforcing the emergence of local jihadist group. Let's just take the two regions, for example. Terila, you know that the problem of terrorism has been a major problem in West Africa, going back, to the era of 1980s and 1983, particularly 1989, when there was a major problem in terms of, failure of electoral processes in Algeria. The failure of electoral process in Algeria that led to the emergence of the Salafist group for preaching and combat, the GSPC, that later in 2006 then transmuted to the Al-Qaeda in the land of Islamic Maghreb. However, even though that we can say that the seed of violent extremism, particularly in the Lukta-Koguma region, which is around Mali, is only but a product of failed electoral process in Algeria that laid the foundation for the emergence of the GSPC, and then which transformed in 2006 to the Al-Qaeda in the land of Islamic Maghreb. I think that the problem we started having, more especially in that region, is intricately connected to the failure to the arson of Muammar Gaddafi. You cannot really discuss descent of violent extremism in the Sahel region without connecting it to the consequences of the forced removal of Gaddafi, following, of course, the Arabellion, or what people call the Arab uprising. You saw that move through the Maghreb, it affected a bit of Bahrain, Algeria, Egypt, Libya. I think that the West was much more focused on trying to remove Gaddafi. I think that they saw it as a price tag that has to be won. And so with the dynamics of that external intervention to remove Gaddafi, we then saw Gaddafi fall back to his original personality, which is a man desperate to survive. Recall that before his death, he really warned that we were going to have serious consequences in West Africa, and we didn't take that much seriously. One of the things Gaddafi did before his demise was that he emptied his armory, particularly for those who ostensibly claimed that they are going to protect his regime. The consequences was therefore that some persons who claim to be sympathetic of Muammar Gaddafi used that opportunity to loot weapons. And even mercenaries also who came to play used that opportunity to loot weapons. In fact, it is still a major concern that SAM, which is supposed to aim that Gaddafi, I think, has about 7 or 10 of them. Up till now, the international community, I'm not sure, have recovered the SAMs that were looted. So, but what became more consequential was the fact that the small arms and light weapons that were emptied from the Libyan territory found their way and into the hands of these violent extremist organizations. So it enabled and emboldened them. So if you look at the statistics and the level of intensity, frequency, and the scale of attacks we are seeing, particularly in the Lukta-Kokuma region, you will see that first it started with the crisis in Libya, when these jihadists took hold of these weapons and began to challenge the government of Mali. Again, the situation made worse by the military coup, which we're going to go back to in 2012, and then that forced Mali to ask the French government to support it, leading to the deployment of Operation Saval, and later transmitted to Operation Barkhane and stuff like that. Now, that external factor of destabilization of Libya played a key part in terms of bolstering, the firepower of terrorist organizations. But I think again we cannot heap all the blame on external factors. I think issues around governance, particularly in Mali, Burkina Faso, and stuff like that. There has been ethnic tensions running, between the Fulanis and the Arabs and some ethnic Malians, and over issue of land and issue of water scarcity. And so the way and manner democratic government failed to manage this, particularly taking an inclusive governance, was a major factor that now deepened level of the grievances and enabled this violent jihadist group to recruit. If you move up and closer to our own region, which is the context of the Lake Chad, for example, I think part of it again also has to do with external factors, but more importantly, internal factors. But I think the case of Nigeria is more or less internal factors. I don't think we'll have enough conversation because of time today. But again, you see that part of the problem we started having in the Lake Chad region was the way and manner in which successive Nigerian government was unable to more robustly and more creatively deal with the problem of Mohammed Yusuf. And so this is a guy who it was open and is well known to some of the governments in Nigeria, even before the Yar'Adua administration, that this guy have external connections with Al-Qaeda. This guy has been receiving money. But the Nigerian government wasn't bold enough, wasn't creative to deal with it. Then we mismanaged the situation, particularly following the event of the July 2009 revolt, wherein he was captured alive and then brutalized and eventually extrajudicially killed. I think, again, that mismanagement of that point led to the radicalization of the group, again, creating opportunity for much more radical persons like Abubakar Shekau to emerge as the leader, and in his own desperation to survive, he started to expand and extend the tentacles to other established jihadi movement. Shekau was able to establish connections with Somali-based Al-Shabaab that then trained the first set of suicide bombers he was using beginning from 2012. Again, he was able also to pledge allegiance to the Islamic State. So you now see that the mismanagement of some of these internal issues by African states played a key part in the emergence of violent extremist group. But I think I just have to conclude here, then we'll continue the conversation. Again,
yes,
I think we also
I'll ask you to conclude that.
Yeah, we can look at the influence of the way and manner in the international coalition against the Daesh, that is the Islamic State.
So that's where I wanted to. That was actually my next question. So, from the historical view perspective, after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, the external factors, and then we had a series of coalition, even in the Sahel, in West Africa, of international armies, both the American army, armies from Europe, France, fighting jihadists in the region. And that's what were the key outcomes did we see? And this was accompanied by democratization. And a lot of, while the international armies were fighting, so for example, the Niger, the Mali, they were also encouraging elections and other forms of civilian rule. What were the key outcomes? Did we see significant success during that period? Significant success of the international efforts, but also of the democratic governments in terms of civilian governments that were in those regions during that period.
Okay, sorry again, I think you are breaking at some point, but let me just hazard some thoughts on, maybe that's what you are asking me, which is that we saw an unprecedented level of interest of the international community, including coming in as this jihadi wave was moving towards Africa to help stabilize the region. Well, I think if statistics is something to rely on, again, I can't quote them exactly, but I know I have rough ideas. If statistics is something to rely on, you can argue that to a very large extent, some of the interventions by the international community, particularly and principally in the form of the G5 Sahel, West Africa, in form of Operation Bakken, but more importantly also in form of the deployment of the multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, the MUNISMA. I think that if you look at the statistics now coming out in terms of the frequency and the lethality of attacks in Mali and compare it to those earlier periods, say 2012, 2013, 14, 15, there is a sense of which you can really argue that the presence and the contributions of those international community could have played a role in at least maintaining some semblance of stability rather than volatility that we are now seeing in the jihadist sphere. But again, there was a lot of critique about the whole system because people argued that the frequency at which these international communities were establishing foots on the ground led to what we call, the security traffic jam, which means you have a lot of security vehicles or platforms operating in the Sahel, but really not providing the kind of security that we all wished. Well, by benefit of hindsight, I think we can then begin to critique that approach. Because essentially, what we then saw with the security traffic jam was that the whole response to dealing with the threat of violent extremism and terrorism was highly militarized and highly securitized. Therefore, we lost a lot of space in terms of, the kind of creative interventions. We could have used governance, we could have used CVE projects. When I mean CVE projects, I'm talking about counter-violent extremism projects that we can actually use to build, the local people's confidence, to begin to reconnect the local people to the state and begin to strengthen the state. I think we were much more interested in quick wins, which is that these states have really conducted elections, so we can argue that these states are actually democratic states. And we're also more interested in quick wins to say we are not seeing the terrorists because the soldiers are everywhere on the ground. But you see, we were not able to address the formative conditions, the root factors, which lies on grievances, which lies on exclusion, which lies on marginalization, that actually foster the rise of violent extremism. So the security traffic jam, as we mentioned it, actually securitize and militarize the responses to the threats of violent extremism, rather than address the root factors that make it very permissive and propitious, for the rise of these armed groups. So, as you can see, with the resurgence of coup, I think that we can then say that the absence of these security vehicles, whether we are talking about a traffic jam or not, the absence of these security vehicles may perhaps account for why we are now seeing an increase in violent extremism. If you look at the data, I don't have it right now, but as the chart I would have shown, if you look at the Sahel, for example, before 2012, there are just dots here and there around Mali in terms of incidents of violent extremism. But over time, these dots have really blown, and then it's like a dandelion seed we are seeing now in terms of violent extremism. By 2015, Burkina Faso, that used to be a very quiet place, started recording incidents of extremist attacks and violence. And as we are talking about that, 2017, 2018, we have now seen the terrorist violence begin to pop up in coastal states, for example, northern Mali, northern Benin, and northern Togo. It therefore suggests, from benefit of hindsight, that we actually did not use the opportunity we had to deal with the underlying drivers of violent extremism. So what we did was, to bring an overwhelming force and presence in terms of militarized and securitized response. It did not uproot the terrorists. What it did was it forced them to hunker down and then also forced them to splinter. Then they moved away from where the security hit is much, and they began to actually establish sleeper cells. So now that the security vehicle is actually running out of steam, you can then see why we are really now having pop-up attacks on violent extremist organizations. And I think we have a lot of reasons to worry, because what we can then see is that increasingly these jihadi groups are beginning to push state authority away from the Sahel, away from the city centers, and then pushing them actually into the sea. That's where the state authority is moving now, because as they are gaining the grounds in the Sahel, they are forcing them away out of their capital cities. State authority is now moving close to water. And as they get more grounds, it's likely that we are going to end up seeing our state authorities right inside the Gulf of Guinea, because the expansion of terrorism is moving towards that direction.
I'll hold you there, because that's exactly what we'll be dealing with in our next talk. But just to go further, and to build on the arguments you made about the role of international actors in maintaining security, and if I get you right, you make the point that while international actors may have achieved success in terms of controlling, this success is limited because it did not build the capacity of the state or state security institutions to hold the ground in the absence of international actors.
Absolutely.
And that takes us to the point that with the resurgence of coup and the fractured relationship between these countries, especially Niger, Mali, Burkina, countries that have gone under and are now having challenging relationship with international actors, how has this changed? How has this coup regimes changed the relationship between international actors who have invested and have built the response mechanism and the national actors in the region? How has this changed?
Well, I think that we have a lot of reasons to worry, because with the resurgence of coup d'etat, wherein we have juntas in charge of governance and the states in most of these countries, I think there's a lot of reasons to worry. And I can just give you some layered analysis. I'll give you some layered analysis and a bit of what I will claim to be first-hand explanation of what is already happening on the ground, against the backdrop of very useful conversations I've had with these troops, for example, and I'm going to speak so much about in the Chad region, these troops that are already on the ground fighting these terrorists. So let's look at the implications. Because the world have moved to the direction where we celebrate democracy as the ultimate political framework, upon which all issues of society, all societal issues and contradictions will be ultimately resolved. We then tend to celebrate democracy as a trophy, and so everybody wants to go under that trophy. The result, therefore, is that if you're not wearing the uniform or the jersey, from a sporting point of view, and playing in this kind of league, you are seen as an anathema. You are actually sanctioned. Yeah, so that's have implications. Let me look at it from three levels. First, with the rise of junta, we have seen the rupturing of diplomatic relations, diplomatic connections, diplomatic networks and platforms that are actually key to bolstering, if not sustaining, state capacity to deal with this problem. And I'm going to give you examples of this layer. First, we have seen state rupturing of relationship. I think the major culprit we can always mention is relation between the Niger Republic and Benin. Of course, you know that last month Niger was forced to rupture or actually suspend its relationship with Benin on the grounds that it was suspecting that Benin was about to provide a ground for the ECOWAS to launch the supposedly planned military intervention to oust them. The point is this: when such relations are ruptured, it creates a lot of problem for men on the ground. First, that opportunity for collaboration, that opportunity for open door channel of communication is closed. And then issues that required rapid response will not be done, and then that creates a lot of problem. Again, there's also rupture that has to do with state or foreign states. One of the consequences, as you've seen, is that Burkina Faso and Mali, to a large extent, have actually suspended or ended relationship with France. That in itself, for good or for worse, that in itself creates a lot of problem in terms of also trying to access critical weapons, critical hardwares, and critical military assets that you need to deal with this problem. Then there's also the problem of rupturing of relationship between the states and regional organizations. As you know, because some of these regional economic communities, for example, ECOWAS, based on its principle or the Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, that clearly abhors unconstitutional change of government, particularly in Article 1. The result, therefore, is that ECOWAS is left with no option but to suspend and sanction such member. So when you do that again, it denies ECOWAS the opportunity of working with the junta to deal with the problem we are talking about, which is the crisis of non-state armed groups that are challenging these groups. And then the last one is rupturing of relationship that exists between the state and the international body. And again, Mali will be the first culprit I'll mention. Remember also that the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali played a key role in helping to stabilize, particularly the northern part of Mali. But now that the Malian government have forced them to leave, I think that in itself is creating a lot of security vacuum that non-state armed groups like the GNIM is exploiting, not only to establish and to strengthen their foothold, particularly around the Lipta-Koguma region, but begin also to capacitate their affiliates, other groups, for example, those operating in central Mali, and those that have element of presence in northern Benin, northern Togo, and a bit of northern Mali. I think that in itself is creating a whole lot of problem. Now, I think the Lipta-Koguma region is the worst hit, if you look at the statistics and the number of attacks, whereas the Lake Chad region appears likely stable. Let me find a note of caution. I had a extensive conversation with the boys actually currently on the ground that we are training on issues like this. And one of them told me something that is worth sharing. He says, sir, I really do not think that the Lake Chad region is stable now, simply because we have done too well now. He said it's a function of faith and luck. And I asked him why. He said, look, why we've not started having serious problems, particularly around the Nigerian-Niger corridor by the Boko Haram, was that the MNJTF in the last 4-5 years have done so well in substantially degrading the capability of these groups. So that right now, these groups are actually so weak. They're not as strong as they were before. And he said that had it been that they were as strong as they were before this coup d'etat, he said, we would have faced serious crisis. And then I asked him, you said, so what is the empirical evidence? And then he told me something from the battlefield experience that you can counteract. He says, sir, I just had led an operation in the past that I've confronted Boko Haram members. He said, it does not take them 10 minutes to launch RPG on them, on their position. And of course, you know the impact of rocket-propelled grenade, the distances can move. But he says, sir, he conducted the operation just last 2 weeks and he engaged these people for like 1 hour and they didn't fire an RPG. So he asked me a question, sir, they didn't fire the RPG simply because it is not in their stock. That if it would have been in their stock, they would have fired the RPG. So his argument was very simple. He said, because we have substantially degraded, particularly the operational cells they have around the Nigerian-Niger border, that is why we are not seeing resurgence of attack. But just to give you a first-hand information, this group have been able to launch about 3 or 4 attacks in the last 2 weeks. At least I had a conversation with the first commander just this afternoon. And then he told us that they've just launched 3 or 4 attacks around the Niger corridor. And that, again, is a major source of concern because for them, given the problem of the diplomatic sanction against Niger, that could impact on interoperability, that could impact on collaboration, that could impact on cross-border response to this threat. Because again, everybody's looking at the diplomatic sanction in Mali against Niger. So just to cap it, I think the juntas themselves, the way and manner in which they redeploy national military assets to protect themselves, which is regime security, leaves a lot of room that is being exploited by violent jihadist group. And I said because the violent extremist groups in the Lipta-Koguma region has not been substantially degraded before the upsurge of coup d'etat in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Burkina Faso. That's why we are having more or less the intensity of violence and attack we are seeing in that region. Compared to the Chad region, where you rarely see this kind of attack, essentially because by stroke of fate, we have been able to substantially and significantly degrade their operational capability, their mobility capability, as well as their logistics capability. The result, therefore, is that they could not launch much of the attacks. And if you look at ACLED data, for example, much of the Boko Haram attacks are now taking place around Nigerian-Cameroon border. And these attacks actually are not sophisticated attacks against military or security formations. These are just mere hit and run attacks and attacks that are oriented towards stealing food, stealing grains and stuff like that for self-sufficiency. So I think to a very large extent, we are very lucky in this part of the country. And I think that the earlier we found a diplomatic solution to the problem between in West Africa, the better for us, so that we can then have a common room to sit down, discuss, and put resources together to be able to deal with this violent extremist organization. Anything else goes to the interest of the violent extremist.
Thank you very much. You've raised a lot of issues, critical issues for our understanding of how the resurgence of coup has shaped or is shaping the spread or the functions of violent extremist groups in West Africa. Of particular interest, you mentioned extensively the comparative difference between the violent extremist group in the Lekogoma region, Lipta region and Lake Chad region. That's quite interesting. But also, you mentioned how the behavior, the sociology of military regimes shape the escalation of jihadist actions during for the last 2-3 years, especially in terms of mobilizing state security assets for regime security instead of territorial integrity, and that you see that this creates spaces for jihadist groups to engage or to actually occupy and govern or expand their territorial control. I want to go in on that question again to ask you, based on the evidence that you have seen from your work, what do you think is the current trajectory of violent extremist groups in especially the the Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, the triangle, and how, to what extent do you think that these jihadists in this area could connect to jihadists in the Lake Chad region and escalate the capacity or not of the activities of jihadists in the Lake Chad region? To what extent can they influence outcomes beyond violent extremist outcomes beyond their tri-border region?
Yeah, again, I didn't mention that, but I think we need to bring it out. The two major regions in West Africa, we know that is having this problem. Like I said, is the Lipta-Koguma region, which is a tri-border region shared by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and then the Lake Chad region. Some other things that make the Lipta-Koguma region unique and may perhaps account for the higher number of clashes you are seeing is that they also have high number of terrorist groups and the jihadist groups and militias that are operating in that region compared to the Lake Chad region. Even though that in 2017, you know, that Ahmad Agali, who was actually the leader of the Ansar ID, spearheaded the consolidation of these four groups. So the JNIM, they call the JNIM, you know, is a consolidation of the Ansar ID, is a consolidation of the Amurabiton, is a consolidation involving the Messina Liberation Front, and then is a consideration of the Sahara faction or the Sahara cell of the Al-Qaeda in the land of Islamic Maghreb. All these four groups that were consolidated into the JNIM have their territorial spaces they were actually controlling. Not also to mention, again, the activities of the Islamic State in Greater Sahara, led by Al-Furawi. Now, these groups maintain, you know, some pockets of territory now, and they are really challenging the capacity of these three states to govern, particularly in this tri-border region. The consequence for the region and then what it may play out for the Lake Chad region, which I think, again, with proactive action, we could actually prevent that, if not deter it completely, is that the more they gain more ground, the more they are emboldened in terms of their psychological awareness that they have the capacity to acquire more territory, which definitely leads them into the Oliver Twist phenomenon of I want some more. So each community they win should not be a source of satisfaction. In fact, it becomes even a source of encouragement to go more. So the result, therefore, is that if efforts, concerted effort and proactive effort is not taken at the level of the Regional Economic Community and ECOWAS have in mind to begin to develop a unique mechanism to respond to the problem in the Nsukka region. I think that these states, particularly the three most affected states, beginning from Mali, then followed by Burkina Faso, may lose a lot of territory to this group. Remember, when jihadist groups take hold of territory, they tend also to invite people to join their group. Saw what happened in Syria and Iraq, particularly with the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Now they invite a lot of persons to become part and parcel of their caliphate. I force that if we do not take any proactive action to begin to roll back the gradual territorial expansion of this jihadist group, we may get to a point where we have something similar to what we had in Raqqa or where we had in Mosul, wherein these guys will seize control of territory, wherein these guys are going to invite foreign jihadists to come and support them, and wherein it makes it extremely difficult, much more difficult than it should have been, for a coalition of regional forces to root them out. Then how does this connect to the Chad region?
Let me stop you there. Are you calling for increased cooperation between ECOWAS, despite its principle of principle against coup, to cooperate with countries under military regime? Is that what you're saying?
If the primary purpose of ECOWAS is the ECOWAS of the people, no longer ECOWAS of government, Terila, I have to take a radical point of view to say, look, I think this is when we need to suspend a bit of this same policy of sticking to the provisions of Article 1 of ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance. And I tell you this with every sense of conviction, and I tell you this with every sense of confidence that, look, Tarila, these sanctions have not worked. Tarila, these sanctions will not work. These sanctions are only working to the extent that is making the situation much more vulnerable. I'll give you an example of Niger, for example. Look, every money that comes into the pocket or the coffers of Niger will go to the junta first. So the result, therefore, is that they will be the first to buy fuel, even if you cut off their lives. It is the local people that are actually not assessing this. Instead, it is creating more room for these terrorist groups to take a foothold. I think that this is where constructive dialogue, strategic engagement comes in. We need to begin to develop, a context-specific, unique, and ad hoc mechanism that creates a corridor of diplomatic connection between ECOWAS and this group. In as much as we continue to ring the bell that their time is up, they need to transition to democracy, we must also recognize the fact that as it stands now, they are the ones that are holding the ship of the state, and they are the ones that can direct it to any direction they want. So if we insist on not talking with them, if we insist on not having a backdoor channel of strengthening their capacity to deal with the violent extremist groups, I think that on the long run, we may be the one that will lose, because these violent extremist groups are likely going to gain more territory. Like I said, the more they gain territory, the more they dig in, and the more it makes it almost difficult for you to recover those grounds for them. If you understand the historical trajectory, if you understand the level of casualties and the level of sustained military losses that we incurred on the part of Nigeria, to begin to force Boko Haram out of the communities, out of the local government they had in the past, then you begin to understand what I'm saying. We are just talking about the Northeast and a bit of the Difa region and the far north region of Cameroon, and then the Lake Hamis region of Chad. The Nsukka region is a very big area. And so if Nigeria lost men and material just to recover very, very few local governments at the height of Boko Haram territorial occupation, what do you foresee will happen if we are going to go into a region that is almost 4 times the size of the area that Nigeria fought the Boko Haram? And also fighting with groups that are much more entrenched, you are fighting with groups that are much more experienced, but more importantly, you are fighting with the groups that have foreign fighters who have gained battle experiences and then are helping to build the generation of jihadists in the Taliberi region and in the Nsukka region. I think that the more we spend time thinking of coming up with a creative response to this, the more it's going to make the challenge of resolving them difficult. I think we need to work with the junta, but more importantly also see the way and manner in which we can leverage political and diplomatic approach to resolving the problem. particularly in Mali. I don't think that bullets and guns will really solve the problem of violent extremism and jihadism as we are seeing. I think a much more robust, balanced approach, that looks at the merits and the tools of non-kinetic response will also be very important, bringing it into the entire gamut of counterterrorism strategy that are being implemented. Because I think for now we have been largely militarized in our response.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's from us in Conflict Research Network West Africa. I think this is something that is important to us as scholars and as researchers to reflect the context. While we agree that the principles of democracy and the principles of the ECOWAS Charter and the rules and norms of ECOWAS Charter are important and should continue to guide our actions as people from West Africa, that we must also respond in constructive and innovative ways to our challenges, which will require us thinking independently. Of course, we do not necessarily share the view that you have just espoused in this discussion, but we respect it and think it's important that we think out of the box and we do not just limit ourselves to neoliberal or to external views of how our region should be governed or how we should respond to our challenges. And with that, I will ask you briefly before we open the floor for questioning. I think just briefly, what is your perception? What do you think the future holds for West Africa in relation to violent extremism in the next, let's say, 5 years? Considering everything being equal, considering the current variables that we have. Briefly, for 2 minutes.
Well, to be frank, I don't think we have reasons to be happy. I think this will be a moment of sober reflection, because just look at the speed at which some of these countries are losing territory to violent extremist groups. These are groups that are not ready to leave anytime soon. So I think that going forward, for me, what the future holds is one that appears a bit volatile. My greatest worry is not about the threat we are seeing in the Sahel. I think that the greatest worry is the potentials that these groups are beginning to activate as sleeper cells that are moving towards the coastal states. And remember that it appears as though the coastal states in West Africa are the most buoyant and in terms of military might, but more importantly also in terms of economy. And I'm just going to mention 3 of them and you understand. So if you look at 15 West African countries, I think you're going to count Nigeria number 1 in terms of the economy. They're going to count Nigeria number 1 militarily. That's a fact of life. So you're also going to reckon with Ivory Coast. You're going to reckon with Senegal, and to be like I just said, you're going to reckon with Ghana. These are actually coastal states that has the kind of economic wherewithal to put resources together to deal with the problem we are having in the Sahel, in the North Sahel. So the question therefore is, if we begin to allow, because again, you said you don't buy my idea, and that's very good, that's the importance of scholarship. If we begin to sit down and we are every day reading Article 1 of ECOWAS Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance without asking critical questions about the implications of wasting time and allowing these groups to consolidate. My fear is that they are going to expand. They are never satisfied. Jihadi groups are never satisfied with any territory they have. My fear is that they are going to expand. And if they expand, it's going to have large-scale geopolitical, political, economic implications. From a geopolitical point of view, they are likely going to begin to challenge the coastal states of Gulf of Guinea. From an economic point of view, they are going to begin to kill off the resources that these coastal states will have to be able to deal with governance challenges they are having. But more importantly, and we're going to draw lessons from the Nigerian experience, but more importantly is that these states will not be able to help the states in the hinterland, these landlord states, for example, Mali, Niger, and stuff like that. Why do I say Nigeria is a typical example? Terila, me and you have been in this terrain studying the landscape of conflict and insecurity in Africa. You recall that Nigeria used to be celebrated as Africa's #1 troop contributing country to the United Nations peace support operations around the world. But beginning from 2009 and 10, we lost that, particularly in 2013. We lost that top position. In fact, the United Nations used to actually compensate us with the chairman of the C-34. and the C-34 is the United Nations Committee that's in charge of peacekeeping operations. It was as if it used to be Nigeria's birthright. Every other country leave that chairmanship for us, just to compensate us for what we have been doing over the years, contributing the largest troops to peacekeeping operations. But as soon as the Boko Haram began to expand and consolidate, we even lacked enough troops to control our territory. That was why we couldn't contribute enough troops to Mali in AFISMA. We couldn't contribute enough troops in AFISMA. And now, even in the multinational joint task force, Nigeria wasn't able to contribute troops as it used to contribute in the 80s and 90s. Not that we don't have the soldiers, but the bare imperative of survival demands that we need to use the little soldiers we have to fight the problem in our home and our backyard. My argument is that, and that's why I say we need to, leverage deep thinking and forward-looking posture to begin to deal with this problem, rather than, subscribing or genuflecting to sentiments that are wheeled around, words that are in a protocol.
Thank you very much, Prof. I will now open the floor for questions for participants who have questions. You can indicate by raising up your hand or by unmuting your mic and ask a question, or you can also type your question on the chat. The floor is now open for further questions. Let's due to time. Okay, in the absence of further questions, I will ask for I will invite Professor Onouha to briefly give us some concrete next steps. Hello?
Please.
Yes, can you ask your question?
Hello? Can one make comment? Is it just about questions? Can one also make comments?
Oh yes, please feel free to make comments for 1 minute.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Yeah, just go straight to the comments.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Tarera, and everyone. In Prof's very lucid and expository presentation, which I commend so much, he made a number of comments which suggest that the rupture in relationship between France and its former colonial territories has also contributed to the exacerbation of the ongoing conflicts or terrorist activities within the Liptako-Goma region and even the Lake Chad region generally. Now, we need to understand that something happened in 2014, which of course was a consequence of the dethronement and the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. In 2014, there was this G5 Sahel State that was founded, comprising Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger Republic. And this G5 Sahel force was massively supported by France, by the United Nations Security Council, by the government of the United States, by European Union, Russia, China, and there's so many others. And of course, the result is what maybe what he called the security traffic jam within that G5 Sahel region. Yeah, because instead of ameliorating the security situation in the region, it further exacerbated it, regardless of the whole international support that came from these countries and organizations that I just mentioned. So do you think in real sense of it that the rupture between the diplomatic rupture between France and its former colonial territories that are now under military government would actually exacerbate the problem, given that when there's apparently supported this government, there was no improvement in security situation within the region? So that is my first concern. Then, don't you also think that it is time for these African countries that have been under military rule to begin to build new alliances that might not even that might enable them to overcome most of the sanctions and the challenges posed by ECOWAS sanction and the isolation, and even isolation by the international community, both the US, European Union, France, and the rest of them. So don't you think that a military, economic, and a political alliance on the part of these affected states would help improve the security situation in their region, bolster their economy, and also enable them to address the key domestic economic issues that are commonplace within their domestic territories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Onouha, do you want to respond briefly to that before we move to the next question?
Well, thank you, Chikodi, for those comments. Again, maybe because I didn't speak more on the G5 Sahel, I think it is implicated on expression of the security traffic jam, because at that point in time, remember we had
You're muted, Freedom. Can you unmute? Thank you.
So sorry. I said I just want to thank him for bringing out that again, because when he's just sharing thoughts, those of us who think that we are in the terrain where everybody is in the same terrain with us, whenever we use this language of security traffic jam, it implicates the miasma of several security arrangements, whether bilateral, national, or multinational. Yeah, I agree with you that I think this is time for us to go into deep thinking, which is the critical question as to whether the presence or the proliferation of all these security outfits did stabilize the region. Well, I don't want to misinform the House, but I think if you fall back to accolade data, I think to a very large extent, I think one way or the other, their presence was at least preventing the kind of large-scale attacks we are now witnessing now, particularly with the killing of so many persons in Mali. Those we are, I think it was last month or last 2 months here about in one of the rivers that they have been transported. Over 60 persons were killed in that attack. But the critical question you are asking is what I have reflected on. These security traffics, we are all moving in the direction of just having presence, not in the direction of taking Mali to the destination. The direction that will take Mali to the destination is presence that deal with the underlying factors and causes, the root causes of grievances, particularly along different ethnic lines, along social lines, and then along regional lines. The grievances have not been addressed, which actually is a formative environment for terrorist groups. A sense of marginalization was not there. Not also to forget the fact that sometimes, again, these security outfits are more or less there to pursue and protect the interests of their own countries rather than the interests of Africans. And even there is a whole debate that they are also actually creating the right corridors for the looting of African resources. I don't want to go into that. But the point I'm trying to make is that Mali have taken the initiative to ask them to go, and they are going. And Mali is now seeing an upsurge in attack. I think that is really what implicates my position, even though that Tarila never liked it, which is we need to sit back and reflect deeply. Are we going to leave ordinary Malians, ordinary Burkinabes, and ordinary Nigerians to live at the mercy of this violent extremist group, essentially because their country or the ship of state is under a junta? My answer is no.
I will stop you there, Freedom, because you respond to the question exactly, and thank you very much for that response. I will say that not that I disagree with you, but I think that it does not reflect, just for the purpose of clarity, the position of the Conflict Research Network, and that these ideas are important and that it should all come out. And we hope that policymakers and civil society organizations, especially civil society organizations, use this evidence to advocate for the type of change that we want to see in our region. I will invite Professor to ask his question.
Hello. Sorry, please. I have a question.
No, please. Can you wait?
Thanks for giving me the floor, and thanks, Professor Freedom Onouha, for your interesting presentation. Two questions really. First, one of the drivers of the current military takeovers across the region is the perception among key elements of the military that the civilian-led governments and not prosecuting the counterinsurgency operations and the war against violent extremism very well. So that is a critical factor, whether in Burkina Faso, in Niger, or most importantly in Mali. Now, from your assessment, what has been the change in terms of counterinsurgency operations and the successes, comparatively between the civilian and now the military, the military-led government? The second question, is good for you to make an advocacy for a relaxation of democratic norms in the region for strategic security reasons. My question, to you, do you think regional actors within the ECOWAS context are unaware of some of the security implications of the sanctions against these, the implications of these sanctions in the collective effort to rein in these insurgent groups, and what measures they are actually also taking to address that possibility, because this is all a matter of trade-offs. So thank you very much.
You need to unmute your mic, Freedom.
I presume you are the one muting me, right? Because I never muted myself. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Dr. Uki. Well, nice also to hear your voice. I think it's been a very long time. Doctor, I have to be very frank with you, and then I will speak, and hoping that maybe some other time, if this thing has to do with formal presentation, then one can compile data. You are absolutely spot on, and I did mention it in the earlier part of my remarks, that one common thread running across the justification frameworks of this junta, whether I'm talking about Mali, Niger, or Burkina Faso, is that they argue that the civilian governments have not been able to deal with the jihadist group. There are two reasons they give to that, and I'm going to puncture that. If you take the case of Mali, for example, it was a major factor they figured and they mentioned. But the reality is that Mali have now witnessed much more attacks in numbers and in scale now that there is under military rule than they were when it was under civilian regime. The second point is that these groups, in the case of Mali, are increasingly taking more territories and are expanding. And in fact, even conducting very audacious attack against military formations in northern Mali. In most cases, even the military formations are overrun by these jihadists. So in a sense and in a balance, I really do not think that the junta have done better than the civilian regimes they ousted on the grounds that they've not been responding to security. Maybe several factors could explain that. Maybe because, again, some of these junta are now suffering under the weight of sanction, and so they may not have the kind of room to maneuver like the democratic government that will enable them to respond to the problem. So on that grounds, I don't think that the junta have done better than the regime that they've removed in terms of raising the security bar for the local and vulnerable population. Then what has been the success in terms of counter-terrorism response by the junta? Again, let me draw the case of Niger. If you look at the Nigerian experience, part of the reasons the Nigerians raised was the whole issue of insecurity in Niger, and that's why they removed Bazoum. One of the delicate issues you may not see or you may not hear around the Bazoum case was concerns the military raised around the issue of Nigerians' rehabilitation and de-radicalization program. In fact, Diaz even gave room for the delegates, as we call it in Nigeria, those who pass through the reformation program. It gives them opportunity even to join the military, and it is something that the military has been really, really against. So what would that be? Now we are having the junta. I think now that Niger is under junta, the consequence is that the prospect of that rehabilitation and reintegration program may likely be bleak, because if they are going to continue running that program, I'm not sure they will run the program as it is originally conceived. I'm sure they are likely going to delete or expunge that provision or that provision that allows somebody who has been reformed from that program to have the opportunity of joining the Nigerian military. So by and large, to be frank, if you have been following the conversation, I really do not think that they have done well. The conversation I had with the first commander this afternoon, he too raised this concern that gradually Niger has also started witnessing pockets of attack, not as large scale as they used to have before, but he said in the last 2 weeks, I think there are about 3 attacks in Niger that is attributed to the Boko Haram. Now, if we have not been lucky to fundamentally and significantly degrade the Boko Haram to the stage that we have done, perhaps we would have been saying something worse than this. The Nigerian military couldn't have been in a position to be able to respond to the level of attacks we would have witnessed, if not that the group has been significantly degraded. So my answer will be very simple. I don't think that the junta has been better in terms of security scale. I don't think that the junta, whether I'm talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger, I don't think they've been able to deal with the security challenges better than the regime they've removed. That would be my assessment. But again, I say we cannot keep on saying because the junta will not respond, because it creates more problem for us going forward.
There's also the question of
the second point. That's the second point you mentioned. Whether I think that those, particularly at the level of the ECOWAS, are not aware of some of these things.
Exactly.
They are aware. Doc, you will agree with me that sometimes again we concede to them that they are aware. But you see, I was among those who were very vocal and critical about the response of ECOWAS to just jump out from nowhere and giving a man with the gun, you're just giving him 2 weeks to return power. So I'm just saying this because we are students of political science, and you know the enormity of power when you control it. And so you may conclude that they know. But I also think that they may not be forward-looking and deep-thinking that will inform the kind of engagement that they ordinarily should do. And I say it, the first failure grade they got was the way they responded to the Nigerian regime by just giving them 2 weeks to hand over power. But Prof, Doc, you can see between me and you now, how many months are we running? From July up to now, these guys are already digging in. So from a strategic analysis point of view, that was a major F-grade performance on the part of ECOWAS. And that's why I'm calling for something that is much more strategic, something that is much creative. We can begin to design, a framework that will leverage some of the persons that have deep contact with these groups to begin to create an opportunity to support them informally to the extent that the support and the resources is channeled towards dealing with insecurity, but at the same time, keeping pressure on them to develop a realistic programmatic response in terms of transitioning to power. Let me just release one thing again, please. Although you said this is being recorded, and I'm being hesitant to do that, so I'm not going to quote the source. Now, you know that there was a rearrangement of the funding mechanism for the multinational joint task force 6 last year. So the result, therefore, is that the member countries are now contributing money to fund the multinational joint task force. But you see, with the problem of the junta now, we already have a problem in terms of funding the multinational joint task force. Therefore, as you know, one of them, I won't mention them because I have to sound diplomatic now. One of them have paid their own subscription for the MNJT of food. In fact, 2 of them have paid food. One of them paid half and is hoping to pay up the balance, but one did not pay. And the one that did not pay, there's no need hiding its image. Niger has not paid, again, because it's under suspension. So that in itself is a major problem for the operation of that group. These are not things we are supposed to say because, again, if it lands to the ears of terrorist group, they can actually begin to think of how to exploit that vacuum. But just to give you an idea of the danger of saying, we will sit down, we are civilians, you are military, so we are not going to talk with you, we are not going to work with you until you hand over power. I think that is good. That should be encouraged, but I think sounding much more pragmatic rather than idealistic will help a situation. In the context of fighting violent extremism, I'm not talking about political democracy. I'm talking about fighting violent extremism. Pragmatism is much more needed now than any other thing.
Thank you very much. Again, we have one more question, and that will be the last question because we are at our time is up. But before the question, Cletus Mambo, I will call Onouha Freedom to reflect clearly that although we want to fight violent extremism, we also want to build our institutions, and that in the sustainable way to build these institutions, to fight violent extremism or to fight insecurity, is to strengthen institutions in our region, in the countries, and we cannot do so without paying attention to the governance mechanisms, whether it's democracy or which way. I think this calls the question. It's a much more broader question of this is a question that has lasted for very long. What kind of institution, what kind of governance mechanisms best fits our context and our challenges in West Africa? Is it democracy, quasi-democracy, or what should we call it? And this is not the forum for that, but that's why we enjoy political science, that it allows us to think deeply and reflect broadly on these issues. Hopefully we'll meet in a conference and we'll talk more about these issues over some lighter chat. Cletus, please, you have the floor. Just briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yeah, 1 minute. Terila, before he jumps in, so that I don't lose my thoughts. I think I need to make this point clear so that people doesn't go away with the wrong impression. And this is where me and you are getting it right or wrong. You see, I say the responses has to be context specific. In this context that you've invited me to speak, the genie is out of the bottle already.
Yeah.
The genie is out of the bottle. So if we're going to strengthen democracy, we're going to strengthen democracy to prevent a relapse to coup. I am talking about dealing with the coup that has already happened. So the genie is out of the bottle. So let's go ahead, please.
Okay, Cletus, please, your name, your just short introduction, and then your question or comment.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sure. I just want to appreciate this kind of conversation, Prof. This is highly informative, and it's academic discourse issues that we need to be holding. I just want your comment. Maybe I could have missed, when you were making a statement, but I want your honest comment on whether violent extremism is also as a result of weak democratic institutions, as well as failure by local, regional, and to a large extent, even continental organization leadership to be honest with one another. It's failure to be honest with one another in the conduct of political business could also be a reason for the rise of violent extremism. Any comment, Prof?
Cletus, thank you so very much for that intervention. I think I have to agree with you completely. And I know the time is up, but I'm sure Terila can stretch it. Terila, you have put me out of my training program, so I have enough time to discuss as long as you want, unless you have any engagement. First, let me thank Cletus for this intervention, which is the question around whether Africans or our governance system is not complicit in the rise of violent extremism. Cletus, I think I will draw a bit of an analogy here. That's why I'm craving that Terila, you give me more time. You see, governance for me is like an operation of a media broadcast. If you see the context of Africa, our governance system has been falling short of two levels. First, it operates like a media broadcast. So Africans only feel governance, not even high level of positive governance. We only feel governance at the capital and the city center. So as you begin to move away from the seat of power, there is very little or nothing that shows there's a government in power or there is an element of governance to the people. So the more you move away from the capital cities, as you are moving towards the hinterland, or you are moving towards the frontiers of African states, then there is little or no semblance of governance, no structure that suggests that the government exists. And if you do a geospatial mapping, or if you do a heat map of areas of violent extremism in Africa, you will just notice that almost all of them are having concentrations on border regions. And these border regions are actually where the signal of broadcast of governance does not reach. It has before governance reaches to that place by way of broadcast wave, it has disappeared completely. So that space is already open for violent extremist group to exploit. That's number one. Number two is the tragedy of Africa, of governance in Africa, which is what we have already equated with winning election. I think winning election is not governance. Election is just create the space for people to say you are the one we want to use public resources to address public governance. That is actually public challenges or command. Now in Africa, once somebody emerges through election, whether it is fraudulent or whether it's flawed, Cletus, you will agree with me that the African leaders will be the first to call on their speech writers to write congratulatory messages and even call them on phone. That's where the problem begins. Nobody really puts an eye to critically scrutinize against well-known standard of transparency, accountability, and credibility, whether the process through which that person emerged was one that could be considered to be legitimate and credible. That's number one, and that's where I agree with you that our supranational bodies, ECOWAS as a regional economic community, and the African Union fails. But more importantly and unpardonably so, is the fact also that when these people begin to demonstrate anti-democratic tendencies, for example, when people begin to fumble with their constitutional provisions, and then somebody wants to now tamper it so that he will come the third term, in a country that has 200 million, in a country that has 440 million, in a country that has 30 million. So you want to be the one that will run the first tenor, you will run the second tenor, and now you run the third tenor, which is not actually provided for the constitution. If, for example, tomorrow Guinea-Conakry slides into violent extremism, we'll start talking about jihadists as if the emergence does not have a historical root. I think that you're absolutely correct. For me, I think it is high time regional economic communities as well as the African Union need to sit down to design a new matrix for assessing elections in Africa. One, the criteria for African Union to accord recognition of whoever that emerged from that electoral process. Two, and more importantly, having an MPKI, measurement indication, and that was what Nepal was supposed to do. The African peer review mechanism. That was essentially what it's supposed to do. It was supposed to have a mechanism that would keep 247 eye on African governments in terms of those that have been elected, to be sure that their processes or governance processes are strictly democratic, not anti-democratic. And when they begin to, backslide on their own, we could then have opportunities to flag them out, to say, look, what you are doing have implications for the future of democracy in your own particular country. And I will always mention that of Guinea-Conakry. And again, we are talking what we are talking today, discussing easily what we are discussing today, simply because we didn't have problem in Senegal. And it's because of the robustness of the Senegalese civil society. Otherwise, Macky Sall was almost on the verge of going for the third term. So, and this is also a country that we have identified sleeper cells of terrorist groups. I'm talking about Senegal. We have identified sleeper cells of terrorist groups that were operating in Senegal. So imagine if he insists on going on election, he conducts the election and Senegal slides into chaos. That again will be an opportunity for violent extremist groups to emerge. And me and Terila will sit here again and start talking as if the problem is the violent extremist groups, rather than the way and manner in which African states have conducted the affairs of governance. I think that we need to begin to query governance. We need to begin to develop new mechanisms for monitoring African governance processes, and then making sure that the African Union becomes actually the platform and the vehicle for ensuring that everybody remains on track as we run this democratic race.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Freedom Onouha, a professor of political science from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. And thank you to our participants, distinguished participants. It has been a very interesting discussion, and this is why we do what we do at the Conflict Research Network West Africa. It's to bring together research respond to critical contemporary issues, and reflect in a way that captures the local context where we come from and where we do our work. The idea is to bring in new ideas and to challenge current ideas, to say that there could be more, we can do more. And one of the key issues I'm taking away from this discussion today on how what military coup means for violent extremism in West Africa is that governance is at the heart. The way we govern our societies, the way we govern our communities, the way we govern our countries will shape the security trajectory, the development trajectory, and the economic trajectory of our countries. Therefore, there is a need for us to continuously demand for good governance, not in the sense of elections alone, but in terms of really that elections should have meaning, that democracy should have meaning, and it should not be just as a tick-the-box exercise, but that people should vote and should be held accounted for even after elections have been held, whether it is free and fair or whether it is accepted, but that even after these elections are held, people should be able to hold their leaders accountable. That is what democracy means. So while we are, of course, are critical of the resurgence of military coups in Africa, we continue to demand for democratic governments to perform their duties and to be inclusive and to strengthen the institutions of the state in ways that even when we will have threats, certainly, because of the times we live in, even when these threats emerge, that we will be able to respond effectively and counter violent extremism and live in a peaceful and prosperous society. Thank you so much, and I wish you a nice day. And by the way, please follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and subscribe to our newsletter. We'll put the email there. Contact us. Next month, we will have a third in our series, which will look at the spread of violent extremism in coastal West Africa. You will see the announcements, and we will discuss again next month. See you next month, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so very much, Tarila, for having me. And I want to thank each and every one of you that have participated. And Tarila, wish you all the best. So we'll talk offline.
Yeah, thank you.